Hi. Wait, I can't hear yet. Do you hear me? I don't think I hear you.
You know?
Yeah, okay. You freaked me.
How are you?
Good, and you?
Good. Can I tell you that I worked out because of you today?
I went for a walk because of myself. That's my own motivation, making fun of myself online. Hi, Lydia. I can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I was like muted. You'd think I would know how to use this considering I'm on it 10 hours a day with these kids.
Okay, I had done the waiting room because last time there was people on that I didn't know before I even opened it, and I felt bad. So now I'm like, am I going to figure out how to open the waiting room?
Oh my goodness.
Got it.
I'm so glad to be here. I have my drink already here.
Me too. I put mine in a special glass
Me too.
in honor of the book.
Oh,
Oh,
nice.
Mine is a Christmas. It says, "Dear Santa, the wine made me do it."
mine says, my book club has a drinking problem.
Oh, I like that.
My drinking club has a book problem.
That one's good.
That's cute,
Hi,
Michelle.
Rhonda.
Hello. Hi. Come here, give me a kissy.
Mom's working.
I have a book club. A book club.
I have everybody banned from the area. So
Okay. Hopefully they cooperate.
my little one goes, "Can I go to your meeting and wish everyone a Merry Christmas?" I'm like,
Aw,
no,
of course they can.
no, because then he'll want to stay here the whole time. And I'm like, no, go away. Go away.
Okay, the author's joining us now. Hi, Chanel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm going to give it like 2 more minutes because people are still joining in.
Okay.
But in the meantime, does everybody want to introduce themselves and maybe say your name and where you're from? Because not everyone knows each other. And do you want to start introducing yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Chanel Cleeton, and I'm really excited to be with you all today. I'm originally from Florida, but more North Florida. I was born in Gainesville, but I've kind of lived all over the state.
Okay. Now, Ali.
Sorry, trying to turn my sound off. Hi, I'm Allie, born and raised in Miami. And sorry, what else did you need to say? I already forgot.
Just your name and where you're from. Actually, since the book is based on Cuban descendants, like maybe say if you are of Cuban descent or not, so we can use it in the discussion.
Yes, I am. My grandfather's Cuban.
Then not everyone on the meeting will be of Cuban descent. So, okay, Lydia.
I'm Lydia. I'm born and raised in Miami. Both my parents both were Cuban. My father's deceased, but both born and raised in Cuba. And actually, my mom's family had a house very close in Miramar, close to where some of Chanel's stories are.
Hi, everybody.
So that's interesting to me.
So am I.
Rhonda.
Hi, I'm Rhonda. I'm in Tampa. I'm not Cuban, but I met Michelle on a press trip many years ago, and we've maintained friends thanks to social media, and loved the book. And she said, "Oh my gosh," and I got her Bella Vista, and I'm like, I'm in.
Kathy.
Hi, my name is Kathy. I am from Miami, raised here, and I am half Cuban. Please disregard the background noise. but I'm so excited to be here. I actually read this book twice. So I'm very excited to be a part of this tonight.
Christy Zarud.
Hi, I'm Christy Zarud from Miami. I lived in Virginia for a few years, but I'm back in Miami now. Both of my parents are of Cuban descent, so I'm excited. I'm a huge fan. Read so far the 3 books associated with the same theme, so I'm excited about tonight.
Yay. Leanne Alvarez.
Hi, I am from Miami, like I guess 90% of us. My parents are both Cuban, and I read the book so long ago that I hope I remember. I'm sure I will, because I loved it so much. I recommended it to like 50 people.
Oh, thank you.
I went back. I went when you spoke at Books and Books back the first go around.
Okay.
So it's definitely left an impact. So I'm looking forward to tonight.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, Barbara. You want to introduce yourself?
Me?
Yes, you.
I'm in Austin, Texas, and I met Michelle on a travel trip, and I was told her at the time about my experience going to visit Cuba, and we had an interesting discussion about why she didn't want to go. And when she recommended this book, I was excited to read it because I loved my experience in Cuba. I understand the issues, and so many of the people that I met really were reflected in the book. So I was like, I had to come tonight. So that's me.
Michelle Atsa. I'm sorry, I can't get over not using your maiden name.
Hi, everybody. My name is Michelle. I'm from Miami, but I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina for the last almost 11 years. Also, both Cuban parents and very strong Cuban culture growing up. So I love the book. I read it and I listened to the other 2 that you wrote in that series. So loved them, big fan, and I'm excited to be here.
Christy Formosa.
Hi, yes, of Cuban descent as well. And I was excited to read the book just to, I didn't read it when it first came out. I just read it now with the book club, and I couldn't put it down. And I was like, honestly shocked by how much I didn't know about my own background or what my grandparents went through. So I'm, super excited to read more. I've only read the first book, so.
I think Christy already bought it in Spanish to give to, is it your grandfather?
Yes, I bought it for my grandpa. I was so excited waiting for it to come out on Amazon just because I trust Amazon, but it's kind of expensive, but I bought it for
It is. I felt bad about that. Sorry.
It's okay. I'm dying for my grandfather to read it so I could talk to him about it.
Oh, thank you.
Christy Verger.
Hi, I'm Christy Verger, and I also just read it, and it's great. I loved it, and now I'm looking forward to reading the second one. And it did bring up a lot. My family's also came from Cuba, and I never really asked my grandmother anything. So now I'm like, I want to go to her house and talk to her.
Alexis Diaz.
Hi, I'm also from Miami of Cuban descent. My grandmother's Cuban. I read the book last year, and I read the other 2 in the series this year, and I really enjoyed them. And I didn't know that they came out with the Spanish version. I'm definitely buying that for my grandma for Christmas. I'm so excited.
Oh, thank you.
Jeanette Diaz.
Hi, everyone. I'm still on my drive home from work, so I'm sorry. I'm terrible video quality.
Okay, be careful.
Yeah, I am born in Miami and raised here. Both of my parents are Cuban, and definitely have loved these books. They've been some of my favorites. Just the ties to like history that is so relevant and so true. So many of the things that my family went through. So I love reading these books.
Thank you.
Liliane Savignon.
Here in Austin, Samsung has bought more than 250 acres of land in the northeast part of southeast.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry. I'm also on a work call at the same time. I am so excited to be here. And I read the books and the sequels, and I enjoyed all three. I was really looking forward to. I was looking for the Spanish version. I figured that it would be translated really quickly, and I didn't know that it had come out already. So I'm gonna be one of those people that buys it for Christmas for a couple of people in the family. But I really did enjoy the story, and I had great conversations with my parents, drawing parallels from their experiences to what the book taught. So thank you.
Thank you.
Christina Brew.
Hi, sorry, I'm actually walking my dog. I am half Cuban, half Puerto Rican, but I was raised in Puerto Rico. Dad's Cuban, and always really enjoyed all the stories he told us. So when I found out about the book, I think Leanne told me about it, Alvarez, and I read all three of them already, and I'm very excited.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. I don't know the name, but it says JNK.
Hi, yes, I'm sorry. At work, so that's why my video's off still. But my name's Jenna. I'm also from Miami, and my grandparents are Cuban. So it was really interesting reading the story because I felt a lot of the same feelings that she felt going back. And my grandparents are actually still alive, and I've been begging them to go back to Cuba. So I think I'm gonna also give them this book to show them why we should try to go back while they're still alive, so they can tell me a lot of the things that they grew up doing, so it's not the same feelings of having to go back once they've passed. But I thought it was an amazing book, and I was very excited to participate in this, which is why even though I'm at work, I'm like, I still need to be zooming in somehow. So thank you so much for having this, and I look forward to hearing the speech. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
We have one more, Michelle.
Hi, everybody. My name is Michelle. I have my camera off because my kids are screaming in the background and trying to rush them into the shower, but I didn't want to miss this, so I'm definitely here. I'm from Miami, born and raised. My grandparents immigrated from Cuba in the late 50s, early 60s, and I'm actually writing like a memoir for my grandmother now because she's the last living member of my family from that era that came and migrated over here. And I want to make sure that we have like all of her history and the background as to why she came. And I absolutely love the book, and I would always have discussions with her, comparing like what the book said to how her life was at that time. So I really enjoyed it a lot.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, I think that's everyone that has come in up to this point. So if there's other stragglers that join in, we'll just have to include them in the conversation. Before we get to questions, Chanel, if you want to tell us a little bit of how the idea for this book came about. I know I was at your Books and Books meeting when We Left Cuba was coming out, and I heard a little bit about it, but I know this is the first time for a lot of the ladies online getting to hear you speak. So if you can tell us a little bit about your inspiration and your research and your own family history tying into the book.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. First off, I'm so thrilled to be here. It's always kind of special when I can talk to people who also have the kind of same heritage and have their stories shared with me and hear how their family's experiences were. So I always really love that. For me, the book really started, the idea of it came in 2016. So it was when travel was starting to open up, and we actually had a family reunion planned to go to Cuba. My grandmother's family is quite large. She passed away a while ago, but we have reunions every few years. And when the opportunity came to travel to Cuba, we thought it would be this great chance, to see where we came from, to have kind of the older generations take us around and really give that kind of family history to it. And so as we were planning the trip, I had two kind of big things happen. One was that my dad and I were just talking about it, and he kind of jokingly said to me, what if we went and dug up this box that has been buried in the backyard? And I was like, wait a second, I haven't heard this before. I had grown up on, my family stories of Cuba. My grandparents lived with us growing up, so it was something that we really talked about a lot. But they had never told me that on the night before they left, I guess everyone kind of met very late at night, and they buried their valuables and kind of mementos in the backyard of their home, thinking that obviously they were just going to be gone for a short time, and when they returned, they would be able to recover those items. And as a writer, when he told me that, story, I was just really gripped by this idea of, you know, what it must have been like to be leaving the only home you'd ever known, to not know when you would be able to come back. And if you were forced to make a decision like that, and really, you know, as we all know, you could take a suitcase with you and anything of importance or valuables was seized at the airport, what would you save for the day that you could come back? And so that question really stuck with me, and I kept thinking about it and what that would look like in a book form. And then while we had this family reunion planned, my grandfather, who is now 98, became really angry with us and very upset with this idea of us going to Cuba, and kind of launched a campaign to convince 60-something family members that we shouldn't go. And we ended up calling off the trip. But it really opened this conversation in our family of what happened, some of the things that, you know, I think growing up as a kid, maybe they didn't want to share with me, or things that were just perhaps too painful for them to talk about. You know, I think that they loved the memory of all the good times in Cuba, but I think it was a lot harder to really relive the difficulties. And as a result, you know, I had kind of a surface understanding of what they went through, and obviously, you know, the basics of what it would have been like to leave their home. But I don't think I fully appreciated just how violent things were then, how insecure they must have felt, you know, all of the things that they really went through. And so it just really opened up this desire for me to learn more about my family's history. You know, that point that was made earlier about wanting to record those memories, especially the older generations. You know, my grandmother, who I was extremely close to, passed away, you know, a while ago. And so I've kind of lost that connection. And then seeing my grandfather get older, you know, there is kind of that sense of losing those memories and the culture that I think was so important to them to instill in us. My dad was born in Cuba, but he came over when he was quite young. So it's not quite the same, you know, as what their experiences were and having those memories from them. So it was just really important to me to bring that to life. My family came over in 1967. They came over on freedom flights, and they were kind of one of the last groups of our family to go. We have some extended family that's actually still in Cuba, but they were kind of the immediate family, the last ones to come over to the US. My dad was a little boy when they came over. And I think like so many of us, you know, I just really grew up with kind of the version of Cuba that they created in exile. You know, we spoke Spanish at home, although my Spanish is not what it once was, but that was my first language. You know, they cooked Cuban food pretty much every night. You know, it was just always so important to them to bring that alive. And I think as I get older, you know, preserving that and honoring it has just become really important to me. So definitely writing Next Year in Havana connected me to those roots in a different way, I think. And now I've just been able to embark on this kind of journey of learning more about Cuban history that I didn't know about. You know, my family talked a lot about the kind of lead up to the revolution and its aftermath, but there are some events in Cuban history, like I just finished writing a book that's coming out next year about the fight for independence from Spain. And that was something I didn't grow up, you know, really ever hearing about, even though my grandparents weren't born, you know, that much after those events. So it's just been really interesting to get that perspective and to learn more about my heritage.
I think the book was a learning experience for me, like a lot of the ladies said it was. I had like the same idealistic stories passed down, but a lot of the day-to-day and like history or internal conflicts between families, we didn't really get that. So I felt like for me reading it, it was a little bit of a history lesson. And then I would have to go back at the dinner table and be like, was this really what it was like? Is this what you guys experienced? I related a lot to the stories of things being buried in the yard or being left with other family members. And also when Marisol's brother was taken in the camp, kind of hostage, the same similar thing happened to my grandfather. And there was a story that my aunt went to the camp with her husband then to go get him. And he had lost a whole bunch of weight and he was unrecognizable to them because he hadn't been eating while he was there. So that was, that put that story for me very relatable. So my question, hi Nico. My question is for everybody else that read it, like, did it bring up lessons for you or conversations with your family of things that you might not have known? And for those who are not of Cuban descent, did you learn something that maybe you didn't know from listening to your friends talk or from what's on the news?
For me, it brought back everything because my parents came as adults and my parents lived everything as adults and had me in the United States. So I grew up listening to everything they had to leave behind and how great it would have been to have stayed there and how we were going to go back eventually. And my grandmother just, I remember being 5 years old and my grandmother telling me, I don't want to get too attached to anything because we're going back and we're going back. And we never went back and everybody passed away and nobody ever went back. And it's difficult because my parents lived their entire childhood and then their young adulthood, and they came my father came in 1958, my mother came in 1962, but they were both adults at the time. My parents are, my father was in his 80s, my mother is 80 years old. So it was very difficult. And just, I don't know, Chanel, but you hit it on the mark because especially with your first book, the house was in Miramar and they made it into a restaurant, and my mother's house was taken and it's now a tourist attraction. And this is the house that, they grew up in, my mother and my uncle. So it's difficult because I read it and I'm thinking to myself, oh my goodness, this is probably, especially in your first book, this is what my mom went through. And then she had to leave and go through this. And the fact that your character went to New York in the second book, that's when my father ended up in New York when he left Cuba. So it really resonated a lot with me. It was like reading it and seeing like a lot of parallels to my parents' life, and then what I just heard growing up and what I continue to hear. And my only regret is that I wasn't, I guess savvy enough to tell my grandmother, okay, I'm going to write all this down and I'm going to keep all these stories. And now the only one that's left is my mother, and the memories are fading and there's not a lot left. And I'm sort of grasping what I can. And after reading the first two books, I remember I finished the second book. I was in Orlando and I was close to a mall, and I went into a papyrus store and I bought a journal. Like, I need another journal, like a hole in the head, but I bought another journal. And I went back to the hotel room and I just started writing things that I remembered and what it brought up. So these books have hit very close to home for me. And Chanel, I gotta tell you, you're the only one that would make me read a book about Henry Flagler, which I did, The Last Train to Paradise, which I never thought I'd get through, and I got through it, and I'm so glad I read it.
That's a great one. I finished that in 2 days.
So, you're the only one that would have made me read that. I never thought I'd ever read a book about Henry Flagler.
Well, never. Thank you.
Never cared about Henry Flagler or bridges or any of that stuff. And I finished your book, and that was the next one that I downloaded on my Kindle app, and I got through it, and I'm glad I did, because it puts a lot of things into perspective, especially for all of us that live here in Miami and Southern Florida. I never knew half of these things. So my trips to the Keys will never be the same. So thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Well, I'll go. I loved reading the book, and my family story is a little bit different. My grandfather left earlier. I actually texted my dad while I was reading it to say, when did Ike leave Cuba? And he was in 52. So it's a little bit different. He doesn't have the same stories. But we actually went in 2015. We took him back to Cuba, and we did a 18-person family trip.
You had
so
the experience I wanted to have that didn't happen.
We were there for 5 days, and it did take convincing to get him to go, but he loved it. As soon as we got there, he was every taxi driver and all the locals. He was having a ball the whole time we were there. And his house was still standing. He grew up in Old Havana, so we, you know, went there and saw it. That was the only thing left. Everything else was torn down, but it was, I mean, it was incredible. And the writing, it was like I was back there. It really just took me back.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can also attest to that. It was a big deal when I went to Cuba. I was the only one of my family that's ever been back or been, because I was born here, so I had never been. And it caused almost like a civil war in my family when I finally got the nerves to go. And it was even all the time that I was there, I felt very conflicted emotions, just like knowing what my family had been through, knowing their aversion to me going. I felt a lot of that, like those feelings again in the book, that war of emotions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always interesting because when I talk to book clubs where there aren't many people with Cuban ancestry, they always don't kind of understand that part. Like I have to explain it quite a bit, you know, just how passionately people feel about it. And I do have family that's been, it's just a thing with my grandfather, I think. You know, we just lost my great aunt, who was the last of the sisters, but she had been back with her son, and I have like cousins that have gone and stuff like that. I just, I think for him, it's really a thing. And he lives with my dad, and he lived with us growing up. So it's such a close relationship. I was just like, I don't know how to do this right now. And my dad and I kind of decided we need to just wait till, you know, he feels differently or things change or something.
Yeah. Well, what I did was not tell my grandfather.
That's probably the smart. Yeah.
He still doesn't know that I went, and he'll never know, because my grandfather was a political prisoner in Cuba.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
So he was that guy being tortured in the jail, you know? So it was just, it's way too sore of a subject. I just, it would break my heart to tell him that I went.
I have a cousin who went, and he didn't tell his family he was going. So he got to Cuba, messaged a friend and said, can you call my parents and tell them I'm here for however long he went? And my uncle was furious.
Yeah, my parents never understood anybody who went back. They never went back. I mean, they lived a lifetime here and they never went back. And I've never visited, and I really don't have any immediate family that has ever gone back, but I think it's been out of respect to the elders in the family. But my parents just never went back. I mean, you know, it got to the point at one time that they just said, that's it. Our life is here. We're American now. We're citizens. This is our country. I don't care if I ever go back. My grandparents was a different story. My grandparents both passed thinking, you know, maybe tomorrow it will be the day. Even when things were, you know, you could tell it was never going to happen, but the reality never sunk in. It's funny because my grandmother did not become an American citizen until maybe 2 months before she passed. When she was very, very ill, she decided to become an American citizen. And, you know, that's what she did. And she never wanted to because she felt like she was giving that part of her away. So just, it's interesting, the perspectives of people. I think I have a different dynamic because I think I'm a lot older, not a lot, but a little bit older than a lot of I'm like a generation ahead. So for me, it was like, I'm the first generation. My grandparents and my parents were all adults, as I said, when they got here. So the perspective is a little bit different than when some people's parents came as children, you know, because you acclimate and you grow up in the United States and this is your world. But my parents, it's like, I always felt like they had one foot in one place and another foot somewhere else.
Yeah.
And it was difficult for them to let me just have both my feet where they needed to be. So,
I mean, going back to what you were saying, though, we were born here, we live here, but our culture, at least in Miami, is so Cuban.
Yes.
It's like so much more Cuban than it is, you know, typical American in a lot of ways. The way we eat, the music we listen to, the customs in our home. So I felt like I wanted to see that firsthand in Cuba, at least maybe
not what they experienced, but a piece of it. So that's why I wanted to go. That was my motivation to go. But while I was there, I realized a lot of the things that they were saying and why they didn't want me to go either.
Have any of you ever struggled with them saying to you, it's not the same Cuba, that you're going somewhere, but it's not the same place where you grew up?
Yeah, and it isn't.
Like
I mean, I don't think
all
that
the
it is.
time. They say that all the time. Like, you're basically going somewhere. Yeah, it's named Cuba, but it's not Cuba. And
I mean, there are still like there was being there. I felt the connection and the similarities between Miami and like some corners you feel like you are in Miami, and it's the way that people are. There's some things that are constant that are still there, but obviously it's not the Cuba of the 50s or the Cuba that they knew and grew up in. It's not.
It's just hard for them to just detach from that image to what the reality is, I think. I don't know. That's what I think as far as like my parents are concerned. It's really, really difficult for them to understand that.
For those of you that are not of Cuban descent, did you learn anything, or what did you feel reading something that you personally didn't experience or had family influence of?
Is that me? Am I the only one?
No, you, Barbara, and I think there might be another. Hey, Barbara, you're muted, I think.
Well, I mean, I'm a huge fan of historical fiction novels, and I know, Michelle, you and I've had conversation on trips on, you know, why she was adamant about not going. And being raised in Tampa, I mean, we have, you know, around here, we have a huge Cuban population as well. But I've never really had a discussion, you know, with them about it. But in reading the book, it's amazing. I mean, I just can't fathom the idea of leaving everything you know, never knowing if you're going to come back, and the hope that someday they can go back or want to go back and, you know, dig up those treasures in the backyard. I mean, it still gives me kind of goosebumps. And how it can divide the family, where, you know, you have the son that, you know, wants to fight and, you know, bring in change that he thinks is going to be better. And, you know, the father who, you know, they're, you know, very affluent, very wealthy, and they want to maintain that lifestyle. He wants to provide for his family. And so he's doing, you know, what he needs to do to take care of them, without realizing that, you know, with the change in government, he's going to have to leave, you know, because he's going to be the one that could be in prison. And I mean, it was just, I mean, I was enthralled with it. I've got the next book, but I thought, since I knew this was coming, I thought, I'm not going to read that, you know, until we talk about this one. But it just is kind of eye-opening. And I mean, being in Tampa, I have not been there. And it wouldn't certainly be the same not being Cuban, but it would just be kind of to look and you're not going to get the experience, and where the people have struggled. And, you know, now that American companies are coming in and trying to, you know, quote, improve things. I don't know that, you know, I mean, I don't know what y'all feel about that.
I was just going to add that I went to Cuba just because I was very curious about it. I'm a travel writer too, like Michelle, and I didn't have an assignment. I just wanted to go, and a friend of mine and I arranged the trip, and we had a Cuban, he basically grew up in Cuba, and then it was a tech guy who ended up in Canada, but he wanted to figure out a way to come back to see his family. And so he started this tour company. If anybody wants to go, I would highly recommend him. He was wonderful. But so it was a very personal tour, in the sense it was him and two of us. And this, you know, he told us so much about his life and his family and the stories. And, you know, he had a very strong love-hate relationship with Cuba, which I think people who, I mean, I'm hearing that from you, and I saw that in the book. And it was, you know, to me, it was just kind of fascinating, because there are those who left, and then there are those who stayed, and why they stayed and what happened to them. And I thought the book kind of captured both. You know, you could really understand why people left and then why they felt so strongly about the place. But then the people who stayed, I mean, it was interesting getting to know them and how frustrated so many of them were with the way things are there and their inability to, you know, basically do anything, you know, because they're so hamstrung by the situation in Cuba. And I think I went right before Trump was elected. So there was a lot of optimism because they didn't think Trump would be elected and that Obama policies would continue. And, you know, I just felt bad for the Cuban people, the ones that I think are struggling. And I think many of them are struggling. There is a Castro group, but a lot of the people that we met and talked to are just trying to survive.
Yeah.
And that's very, very tough to do economically in Cuba. So that was, it was just fun reading the book. It just reinforced a lot of the things that I saw and this challenge that people have who are in Cuba and who are Cuban and not in Cuba must have. So thank you for the book.
Oh, thank you. And you bring up such a great point about modern Cuba. And I have to recommend, because I think it's such a phenomenal book. This year, a book called The Cubans came out by Anthony De Palma. And he's a journalist. It's called The Cubans. And the author is Anthony De Palma. And he's a journalist. And his wife's Cuban. He's spent a great deal of time in Cuba. And he wrote this book from the perspective of different Cubans that he kind of followed around who are navigating modern Cuba. And it really speaks to a lot of what you brought up about the struggles that they're facing. And he brought a lot of different perspectives. So one of them is an artist who kind of enjoys a little bit of a privileged place in Cuban society because he is an artist. And yet you still kind of see his frustrations and his struggles and kind of the issues. He leaves Cuba, he comes back, you know, he has that kind of love-hate pull. There's another woman who kind of rises up in the Communist Party and then starts to sort of see the fractures and the fact that maybe her life is a certain way that isn't the way that the rest of Cuba is kind of experiencing. She has opportunities they don't. So I really recommend that book. I read it this year and kind of just like honestly bawled through it. It was a really emotional book for me. They're really powerful stories, and I feel like it gives you modern Cuba and kind of just the day-to-day little struggles that they're going through that you wouldn't have that perspective necessarily.
One of the things I was most surprised about when I was there, we also had an incredible tour guide. And, you know, I think growing up, you know, in Miami and, you know, you have kind of one view of what life is like in Cuba, and you have a very, you know, one-track mind. And that was one of the most interesting things I found was she didn't feel the same way that we, you know, in my mind at least, thought, you know, everybody in Cuba, you know, hates what's going on and, you know, is, you know, mad about the way things are. And, you know, but she had a very different perspective on things, which is something I truly had no idea existed, because it's, you know, in my mind it was always, you know, bad feelings about the way things are. So that was really, really eye-opening to me. And she was from Santa Clara, so I recognized that, not that we made it over that way. But yeah, I was truly shocked by that, because I wasn't expecting that at all.
Chanel, I have to say that the research that you did for all three books, but especially the second one, and I think I want to call it creative license you took in the interactions between the main character and Castro, and the conversations that went and the reactions. I mean, that was fascinating to me. And the fact that you keep it so objective, as far as, you know, you read sometimes some authors and you can just sort of like get an underlying sense of what their politics are, where their leanings are, what their feelings are about a certain situation, especially something so delicate as Cuba and you coming from, you know, a Cuban background. But I mean, kudos to you for the research and for just having that dialogue. I mean, and being bold enough to actually put Castro in your book.
It was a little nerve-wracking. I won't say it wasn't.
No, I think that that's very commendable, and making him almost human, you know, because I know I speak for a lot of us here, and you, I'm sure, when, you know, Castro's like the Antichrist for a lot of people. And that's what we grew up listening to and being sort of programmed into believing. And the fact that you made him almost human, I say almost human, and some frailty, and being able to be almost manipulated by this strong female protagonist is just, you know, I think that's very commendable in that book. I mean, that's something that, you know, it struck me, and I think that was, you know, apart from the history and the resonating of the culture, and it just, I mean, it was a bold move, and I think you did it flawlessly. And
well, I have to say,
I thought that was amazing.
I think that's thank you. I think that's what's so interesting with researching these books is you're so right. Like, I grew up, my grandparents would not take communion. We're Catholic. And they stopped taking communion because they said that they had so much hate in their hearts and they wanted him to die so badly that they didn't feel like they could take communion. And I mean, decades they wouldn't do it. So, I mean, I definitely grew up with that sentiment toward him and almost this larger than life figure, which I do think is dangerous. You know, I understand completely, but coming from a background in academics where I did a lot of political research, you know, I kind of want to understand what makes people tick. And I want to understand how we get to places, because I think we learn so much from history. And so if we have these examples, you know, so much of it often we see in today's world. And so it's kind of helpful to understand those past events from a different lens. So one thing that was really interesting for me was going through the historical record, that scene that you're talking about in When We Left Cuba. I did not know this, but after Kennedy was assassinated, like immediately after, I mean, I'm talking the days after, apparently Fidel Castro was just terrified that the US was going to strike against Cuba. And he knew that the suspicion was that he was responsible. And so he was desperately reaching out to people to try to get a diplomatic message through some back channel, like CIA communications, to the US to let them know that he had nothing to do with it, because he knew if they put the full force of, you know, the military behind to try to avenge what happened to Kennedy, he was going to be in trouble. And so I found in like all of my research, there were these moments where he was so flawed, and flawed from a different perspective of, you know, we see him as flawed because of the atrocious things he's done, but also times when you saw him as weak as a leader and weak politically. And so it was really interesting to get that perspective. I mean, obviously with the benefit of hindsight and not living under, you know, that regime, just from like an academic historical perspective. But I wanted to bring that out in places in the book as much as I could, and to kind of humanize him. I mean, I think he has definitely in some ways benefited from this cult of identity. I mean, it's the same thing we see with Che Guevara. And so they've become kind of idealized by people rather than, you know, flawed individuals who, you know, made huge mistakes, who put themselves above ideology, just all these things that, you know, we all know. And so I wanted to kind of bring him down to that level. You know, one thing growing up that I always heard was that when Fidel died, you know, we were going to go back to Cuba. And that was something, I put that in Next Year in Havana because that was such a common refrain. And what was really interesting for me was I actually had literally just sent my editor the first draft of Next Year in Havana when he died. And so it was so weird to think of, you know, decades and so many people waiting for him to die. You know, my grandmother passed before he did, and she was constantly, I mean, just waiting for that event. And then the sad thing was that once he died, we really didn't see, you know, the sea change that I think so many people thought we were going to see, of all of a sudden things opening up in Cuba. I mean, obviously now, you know, it seems like there is a pushing movement, and so who knows? But at the time, that was certainly very sobering, this idea of, you know, this thing that we've all been waiting for. And certainly there were celebrations, but yet, we're not seeing that change that I think so many people had hoped for.
I'm currently reading that second book, and I have a vote going on Instagram if that would be our next pick. So if anybody wants to read it next, please let me know. If you want to take a break and read it one in between and then the next one, let me know. But I definitely want us to read that one at some point.
Yeah, I have to piggyback off of what Lydia was saying and give you kudos, Chanel, because you really captured the perspective of all the different characters so accurately, and so without bias. There's a documentary on Netflix that I recommend to all of you if you're interested in this topic. It's called Cuba and the Cameraman.
Oh, I've heard of that one.
Okay. This guy goes to Cuba over the course of like 40 years and interviews the same people. And you see how their lives start to disintegrate. And he also, he traveled so much between Cuba and the United States that he met Castro and almost became friends with him. And you're able to see how human Castro is. Obviously, we all see him like this demon, and he is in a lot of ways, but that also friendliness that he has and that charisma that he has is what got him to the position that he has, and that's how he won over so many people, my grandfather included. My grandfather at first was with the revolution and then turned against the revolution when he realized what was going on. So you have to realize that there's two facets to everybody. And you did a great job of doing that.
Oh, well, thank you. My family is kind of similar. My grandmother was always very anti-Castro, but my grandfather in the beginning was, hopeful that he would bring change. And I think that's part of why he's so angry, to be honest, because I think he feels like doubly deceived that, in the beginning he thought this could be good for Cuba, and then obviously not.
I think that's a, blanket kind of statement for a lot of us. I think a lot of people were under that impression. But the fact that you brought out him as a vulnerable individual and almost manipulated by her is, it was very interesting, and it was it was a subtle way to show, the strength of a woman at that time, which, that wasn't a popular thing.
Well, and apparently he was a horrific ladies' man. That was always there. Apparently are a ton of jokes in Cuba about how women run him and control him. So I didn't know that.
He was always very charismatic. I mean, apart from his atrocities and his, just the kind of, toxic, terrible human being he was, you can't take apart the charisma that existed, his gift of gab, if you want to call it that. I mean, I think that was obvious throughout history until practically the day he died, and his intelligence. And I think probably that was very attractive to many women at the time, who maybe were even using him as a vehicle to get out of the situations that they were in at the,
Well, and how much of a choice do you have in some situations too when you're in Cuba and he's
but the fact that
hold on power,
you created this character that was strong and willful and decisive and independent and made her own decisions, regardless of opinions and of family and almost like a rebel at the time. Now, maybe not so much, but when this book was taking place 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 60, yeah, because I'm about 50. So yeah, 60 years ago, that's a bold move. And I think you captured that. And I'm sure there's lots of people who will read it in that generation that will read it now in Spanish. Like everybody's talking about giving it to the grandparents or the parents, and that will resonate with them, because I think we're used to seeing stories of very submissive, especially in Hispanic and culture, just be quiet and let things happen. And this character, she did her thing.
Why are all these women so submissive?
Yeah, you know what I mean? She did her thing and she didn't care. I remember that I read the descriptions of the house in Palm Beach and how she was just taking over, and I thought to myself, wow, I could just vividly picture that. And I said, how bold is that? Because that was unheard of.
Since we've touched upon the character of Beatrice, do you want to maybe share the story of how you came up with the idea for that book and how it kind of.
Sure. No, I definitely can. She has a really special place in my heart. And when I was drafting Next Year in Havana, I just thought it was going to be a one book situation. I didn't really envision exploring the other family members. But as soon as I introduced Beatrice's character on the page, I actually stopped writing Next Year in Havana to write the first chapter of When We Left Cuba, because I just had such a vivid image of her in Palm Beach, and really just someone who had kind of been knocked back by life and wasn't going to take it, and had this kind of larger than life personality. I grew up, you say the thing about kind of the submissive stereotype in Latinx cultures, and I grew up with a grandmother who kind of ruled everything in the household. You know, she did it subtly in some ways and not so subtly in others, but it was definitely, she was the head of the family and she kind of mandated everything, and you know, that was just how it was. And I wanted to celebrate that a little bit. She had quite a few sisters and they all had really big personalities, and wanted to bring that to life. And so that was really what, you know, my aim was with When We Left Cuba. And then as I started researching all the CIA attempts to assassinate Castro, including using one of his mistresses, that's when I really had this idea of where to take Beatrice's story. Excuse me.
I have a question. I was just curious. I know you brought up that great, obviously your grandmother, strong person in your life, and the nugget about the story about the buried treasures, so to speak. Were there other nuggets like that in the story that came from your family, or was it interviews or anything you did with other families?
So it was a little bit of a mix. I mentioned that my grandmother's family is quite large, and at the time I wrote the book, she had a sister that was living, and obviously like quite a few children of the sisters. And so I didn't want to obviously make it my family, just out of respect for the extended family and not wanting to tell, you know, their grandmother's story or something like that. But there's definitely parallels there. I mean, my grandmother came from a family of a lot of sisters and a brother, so you can kind of see like the similar structure with the Perez family there. What I mentioned about my grandfather being a little bit more supportive of Castro in the beginning, that really inspired me a bit with Pablo's character, and with wanting to kind of explore how, you know, you could love someone that looked at the world so differently from you, and how those disagreements might play out in a situation like this, because my grandparents were definitely on opposite sides of it in the beginning, but were obviously, you know, married and able to have their family life despite looking at this a little bit differently. Everyone's read the book, right? So I'm not spoiling anything. Okay, so my grandmother was pregnant during the revolution, and that was another thing that really kind of struck me, was wanting to explore that idea of what that must have been like to be going through, you know, such a life change, and then having, you know, this event happen. So things like that, the story that Luis tells about being in the car, and they have the contraband pork, and the car breaks down and they're worried that the government's going to stop them and seize it. That was something that happened when my dad was a little boy, when they were still in Cuba. So little stories like that. El Encanto was my grandmother's favorite store, you know, places that I could put kind of like little Easter eggs or vignettes to my family. I was really fortunate that my grandfather was able to read the book before I kind of turned it into my editor, to give me his perspective, having lived through the events, and kind of like any little memories he had on the day, you know, in the aftermath on January 1st. So things like that. And then obviously just doing a lot of primary and secondary source research as much as I could. There were a lot of declassified CIA reports and like Foreign Service documents that I really used a lot in that one and When We Left Cuba. But really as much like media as I consume, a lot of family photos. You know, obviously I did kind of write from the perspective that my family came from. My grandmother did come from kind of an affluent family. She didn't work, she didn't have an education. She was just kind of expected to get married. And so I wrote the sisters from that perspective, just because that's what I grew up with and that's what I knew. And I wanted it to feel authentic to, you know, where I came from and my family's experiences.
Cool. Thanks.
Questions? Okay. I'm gonna pull a question from Chanel's reading guide in the back. So when Marisol arrives in Cuba, she struggles with identifying as Cuban because she grew up in the United States and because she has never set foot on Cuban soil. How does Marisol's trip alter her views about being Cuban and change her perspective of herself? How do Marisol and her family attempt to keep their heritage alive in exile? And are there stories and rituals handed down through generations in your own family? And also, if you can answer when you comment, if you identified more with Marisol or Elisa. For me, it was 100% Marisol. I grew up extremely close to my grandmother. We shared a bedroom until I was in my 20s, until she passed. So a lot of the stories and that close relationship with one grandchild, I related to 150%. So thank you for telling the story in that perspective. So anybody want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I touched on this a bit earlier when I said how when I went to Cuba, I felt like so many of the traditions and the culture that we have are so closely tied to here in Miami and our experience here in Miami. And definitely like that relationship with the grandmother, I had the same exact thing. I know my sister was supposed to dial into this phone call. I keep searching for her, but she's not on here. She got lost. But our grandmother and her stories, and my grandmother having, my grandfather, like I mentioned, was a political prisoner for 13 years. And my grandmother was alone, a single mom of 2 in Cuba during all of this turmoil. So those stories, we've been hearing them our whole lives. And then seeing so many similar stories in your books, you know, it's just, it was really emotional.
It was definitely a really personal, emotional book for me to write. And Next Year in Havana, more so than the other ones. I had kind of very much that relationship with my grandmother that's expressed in the book. And, you know, her passing away, we had her cremated, obviously with the hope that one day we would be able to scatter her ashes. So it felt, you know, almost like I was kind of getting to live through the character and have these experiences and explore this this part of my heritage and kind of, I think, emotions that I hadn't really tapped into fully until I really started writing the book.
I think also, like with the book, I was noticing the first thing I thought about was my grandparents with Elisa and Pablo and the age difference. And I was like, oh my God, yeah, like that's the first thing that popped in my head. And then another thing, I was like, one of the things, you know, I would always ask my grandmother was, she's the only one that came, she got married and they came to the United States, but they left their family. So then I would always ask her, why is the family still there? Like, why aren't they coming? And then when Anna was talking to Marisol about, you know, it's not that I didn't want to leave. It's just when my parents left, you know, I was married, my husband, you know, was working and he was a photographer and, you know, it was important to him. And then we had Lewis's dad, and just life happens. And, you know, before you know it, here we are. And I went from being wealthy and having it all to, you know, not owning anything that's been in my life, in my family's, you know, life. And it was, you know, many times that happens to us when time just passes us by and we're like, what happened? So, you know, it was really interesting, and all the historical information, it really, like, it gave me a different perspective of everything that, you know, my family went through and other families have, you know, went through. And, you know, and it brings questions of, you know, a lot of questions that I want to, you know, ask my family, because I know my grandparents left like in 53 or 54, and they went to New York, like many, but they ended up going back to visit and baptizing my mom over there. And, you know, so it's like they went back like in 1960. Between 1955 and 1960, I think they went back at least twice. So I'm like, it does bring up a lot of questions that I want to sit and talk to them about. But yeah, the first thing that when I saw when they were at Guillermo's party and talking about the age, I was like, oh.
Did you get any like when you were doing your research on the homes, like the homes in Miramar, and how they were taken over? Because I mean, I know that the family, it was sort of like they lived on the side, and the person who was their household servant stayed there, and that's how things evolved, but how it was a restaurant, and how they, how sort of like the house had to be given up. I mean, how did you come about finding those homes? Did you speak to people who had lost their homes because of that, of the revolution? And I'm just curious. I mean, because I know that my mom's house is like, what we've heard is that it's like a hotel, bed and breakfast kind of thing. And my mom is all mad about it all the time and saying, you know what this is, and they're probably sleeping in my bedroom, and and I can't imagine. And it's just, I wonder how you came to that conclusion, and how you found that particular neighborhood and those particular homes.
So with that one, I mean, my family actually lived in Vedado. Well, they lived there, and then when my grandparents married, they moved to a town called Selimar, which I don't think actually exists anymore. I put it in the book in the past timeline, but it was like a little beach town. But a neighbor that we had that I still talk to said that she doesn't think it exists anymore. So anyway, sorry, little tangent. So my family did not live in Miramar. I definitely wanted people to understand the idea of your house being taken, because that's something that obviously everyone in my family experienced. Also the idea that they were subdividing houses into different apartments. And the big thing, and the reason I kind of put in the whole storyline about Pablo and his ex-wife was that Luis and his ex-wife, was that the housing shortage in the city is a really big issue. And so people are being put in really like bad situations. Like you might have to live with an abusive ex-husband because there's no housing available. Obviously, like maintenance on housing has been an issue. And so I wanted to bring that to life in the book, so people kind of understood just how bad things are. More people who maybe aren't as familiar with Cuba and wouldn't understand some of those things. So that's why I did that. We've actually had people go back and take pictures of my grandfather's house that he had when he was married to my grandmother. And there are people living there, and he's obviously, just what you mentioned. I mean, he's upset. And I think, something that's hard for them to understand, it was certainly something that my grandmother felt up until, she passed, is that she felt like that was still very much her home. And it was hard to explain that there are people that have been living there obviously for decades, that it's their home now, and they have made their memories, and how do you reconcile those two things? And it's heartbreaking. And so on both sides. And so that was something I wanted to kind of explain to people, because I think, I get a lot of friends saying, who aren't Cuban, will say like, well, why are Cubans so angry? Or why aren't they over it? Or what? They don't quite understand. And I think if you take it down to just a universal level of, imagine if someone came in and was like, okay, your house is going to be 3 apartments, and these people are moving in, and it's not yours anymore, even though you've worked and you've saved, and this is like the achievement of your life, for your family. How would you feel about that? And I think when you put it on those levels, people who maybe aren't as familiar with Cuban history or don't have a personal connection, it kind of makes you start to wonder how you would react to those situations. And I wanted to highlight that, because I think that has been such a big issue, from, businesses to people's homes, to the memories that they buried in the backyard. I mean, this book really is about exile, and, my family came here as refugees, and what that is like to just come here with absolutely nothing and have to start over.
And my parents came, my mom came when she was 8. My grandparents were already living in Miami, and my grandmother went back right before she was going to give birth to my dad, because they were here by themselves, and she had him in Cuba, and he came back when he was 3 months old. So I tell him he's a fake Cuban because he has no memory of other than stories. But I have heard stories of not just your house being taken, but the possessions inside your house. My mom would say how they would come in and take any jewelry or anything of value that was in their house, and suddenly it just belonged to the government.
Yeah, and they would inventory what was supposed to be in there, and so what people would do. I mean, it's really like amazing. The Cuban spirit and ingenuity and just like resolve is extraordinary to me. But people would trade. So like if your inventory says you have a fridge and your fridge is nicer than your cousin's, you would give your cousin the nicer fridge so that they would at least be able to have it. You would take theirs that's like breaking down, and so the government inventory is matched. But you've found a way to kind of preserve and help someone out and kind of get around the system that way.
And again, you did such a good job of capturing those details, because if you're not Cuban, if you haven't heard these stories from your family, and you start to see that it offers that perspective of why are people so mad. My father, for one, he left Cuba, never saw his dad again. His dad died in Cuba. And he still is holding on to this idea of, we have paperwork for our properties, like we're gonna get them back one day. And like people, it's been decades that other people have been living in those homes that were seized by the government, like you said. So it's like this, I don't know if it's like holding on to hope or like this delusion that they're gonna go back to the Cuba that they once had.
I don't want to take up too much of Chanel's time, so maybe if we have like 10 or 15 more minutes, if it's okay with you. I do want to touch upon one of my favorite parts in the book, the relationship between Marisol and Luis, because it was, to me, it's so shocking from people with like two completely different upbringings and cultures to somehow find a middle ground where they can relate to each other. So if anybody has any opinions, ideas, thoughts on that relationship, and I am dying to see them back in a story. I know I've said this before to you, but I keep waiting for them to pop up in When We Left Cuba. I don't know if they are in there at some point, but so far, as far as I've read, they're not in it.
And I'll just say they aren't. That is one of the questions I get a lot, is if I'm going to revisit them. I think the thing that I struggle with a little bit, if I'm just being honest with revisiting them, is I feel like there's so much evolving right now with our relations with Cuba that I don't know where I would pick him up. I don't really know what his life would be like with the immigration policy changing. That was actually another big thing when I was writing the book. There was that massive change in the immigration policy, and all of a sudden that kind of affected, how I was getting people places and what their future would look like. And I also, I want to make sure I'm writing from a perspective I feel like is authentic for me. And so writing from Marisol's perspective of being the daughter and granddaughter of exiles, felt like something I was familiar with and I knew, and I felt like I could write that authentically from my lived experience at least. But writing from the experience of someone who has grown up in Cuba, I do feel a little bit like that isn't my lived experience. And so I don't know that I would be able to tell his story from his perspective. I mean, it was one thing to kind of include things that, people we knew have lived through in Cuba, but another thing to tell his story, I think.
There were so many moments that I was like nerve-wracking, like when they were trying to figure out the plans on his escape from the island, basically. And also when they were walking down the Malecon and Marisol was taken, right? I was like, what is happening? She's a tourist. What is going to happen to her? Anyone have any thoughts on their relationship?
I loved the comparison, the similarities, I guess I should say, between Marisol and Luis and Elisa and Pablo also, that, you kind of saw the same, their history repeating itself with, falling for someone that is from a completely different life and background and, way of living. And it's kind of just, I loved seeing that the same thing was happening to Marisol as did her grandmother.
Yeah, I liked being able to kind of play with those parallels. And I think the thing with Cuba is it feels like it's just, the more I researched, the more I saw parallels in the two timelines. And so I wanted to kind of bring that out a little bit. And that idea of kind of having that connection to the past and then maybe making, you know, decisions or having experiences based on that connection.
Does anybody have any other questions before we start to wrap it up? Anything you want to say? Any part of the book you want to bring up that we haven't touched upon yet?
I actually have a question, but about the last book that came out, The Last Train to Key West. So one of the characters, and I'm blanking on her name, the one that came from Cuba that married and the man.
Yeah.
She was related to the Perez's how?
So she is Elisa and Beatrice and the sisters. She's their father's sister, so she's their aunt. And she, so she's their dad's Emilio. She's their sister, or his sister, and she's going to come back. I'm actually working on a book now that's going to be out in 2022 that revisits the sisters. She's in the book as well. So you kind of see the family interacting in the previous books. Like it kind of all comes together.
Awesome.
It's visiting what sisters? Beatrice, Marisol, and
it's going to be Isabel's story.
Okay.
So she's I decided to tell her story, and it's really kind of been a fascinating book to write. So I'm enjoying it. But that one will be out in 2022.
I think you should write about all of them.
I know. I'm in love with this family and hearing their stories.
I almost, you know, I read them as soon as they came out. The first, the second, I mean, I read them all as soon as they came out. And it's just, you know, I want more. And I know you can't write that quickly, but, but I want more. And I don't know if anybody's read the third book. I mean, I'm not going to give anything away, but just the fact that, you know, now we're in actual Florida and we're all in Florida, and, you know, reading about it, as I said before at the beginning of when we first started discussing this, you know, nobody would have made me read about Henry Flagler.
And I didn't know about that hurricane.
I didn't either. I grew up in Florida, and I had never heard about it until it was Hurricane Irma when I heard about it.
Fascinating story, you know, and try to put pieces in your head. And I think for a lot of us here, once you read the third one and you know, we've all been down to Key West at one point or another, and you try to like picture in your head what you're talking about, you know, in that time frame. Have we been there? Or were we down that road? Where is this? That's what I found myself doing.
It was
also,
it's just amazing how you connect it all.
How you connected it. And she mentions in the book how her brother stayed behind with the family business. And it kind of gives you like a window into why he held on to that for so long. Like it was all on his shoulders. He was the one responsible for maintaining that family business. And then, you know, this change in government comes and everything that happens to them happens. And he has like this like weight on his shoulders, this chip on his shoulders of having to make the family successful here in Florida. The way that you connected all three books was magic.
Yeah. I have a question on the last one, now that we're discussing it. What was her name? The one from New York, is it Elizabeth? Is she connected to the Prestons in the second book?
She is. So she's kind of a distant cousin. It's not a direct connection. I'm fleshing out if we're going to see more of that family, I will say. So we'll kind of see them. I'm playing with that right now in this new book as well. So we'll see if they come back a little bit. But she's a distant cousin to Nick and when we left Cuba.
It was so hard for me to read stories from like three very submissive women in like three different ways. And the relationship abuse in one of them, at one point I was like, I texted Kathy, who was ahead of me, and I was like, tell me that this is not throughout the whole book because I cannot take this for more than a chapter or two. It was so hard to get through.
I just wanted to,
I mean, it was brilliantly written, but just reading it, I was like hurting for her.
Yeah. It was hard to read. I mean, hard to write. No, it was, and it was one of those things where, you know, I wrote the book when we were kind of seeing the Me Too movement explode, and we were talking so much about the treatment of women now. And it really made me think about, you know, we still see so many problems today what would it have been like decades ago? And that's what I wanted to kind of explore, you know, what it was like for women back then. And Helen's voice was the one that really came to me first in the whole book. And so her experience kind of framed the novel for me, but it was emotional. And I'm a reader who I can't read, like I have lines for what I can read before I just get like very emotional. And so I tried to keep it, you know, I wanted people to get a sense of what her life was like, but I didn't want anything to feel gratuitous or, you know, like it was there for shock value. I wanted it to kind of just tell her story and how strong she was.
I'm not going to give anything away, but the ending I did not see coming like at all.
Oh.
I know. That was a plot twist. There was one, I mean, there were some things that I kind of was like,
Don't
okay,
spoil
I
it.
saw it coming, but
Don't
that,
spoil
I
it.
don't want
Don't
to give
spoil
it
it,
away.
please.
I'm not. But that one part,
Everybody go read it now. Like, you know,
I think we need to have a book club to discuss
I
this.
have this one next.
The book club is just going to become a Chanel Cleeton book here now.
this is gonna, I mean, I really just I'm like in awe over the research because I'm like a research nerd, and you know,
fact check.
I'm just in awe over the research, and you know,
Well, that means a lot to me because that's the part that's the most time consuming, to be honest. So I appreciate that you appreciate that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I
As I'm
really
reading
do.
like 100 books on, you know.
And I think as the 3 books, I don't want to call it a progression because they're standalone stories in themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, you know, especially in the last book, maybe because I just was so just drawn to just the whole history of it, and I chose to explore it further. I really could appreciate just how much research and how factually accurate things were, because I think a lot of times, especially us of Cuban descent, if we find a book about Cuba or something that can resonate with us about exile, we just latch onto it and we read it and we think, oh yeah, we can totally relate. But this, yeah, we can relate to it, but it's also chock full of facts that for people who maybe haven't lived that experience, it's an eye opener. And it's, I mean, it's almost a history lesson in an entertaining, fictional form.
To me, that was the best part because I learned like so much that I didn't even know that I didn't know about the story. Like your story was great. You weaved in like a really good story with like great history lesson. Like
yeah,
awesome.
Yeah.
And I've only read the first one.
Especially learning about Fidel. Like there was so much I didn't know about him, and I go and I look at my husband because he's loves history, and I'm like, is that true about Fidel? And he's like, yeah, and I'm like, and then I would start like keep reading, and then I'm like, and I look at him, and he's like, yes. I'm like, I learned a lot. Yeah, definitely.
Oh, I love
The
that.
time you spent doing that research is so well spent because it
Yeah.
sparked so many more conversations, either between families who are Cuban and who have that history, or for somebody who doesn't know about it as much to look into these things. Like I read a book recently called Code Name Helene. I like fiction.
That one, I haven't read it. Okay.
I'll send it to you. I follow you on Instagram. I'll send it to you. It's also a historical fiction, but I like fiction books because I like getting lost in a story. I don't really want to sit down and read and learn. You know what I mean? But I love it when it's like weaved in there and you just learn so much because you find yourself Googling all these facts and fact checking and asking questions to people who would know more about this subject. So I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
This book definitely opens up my curiosity about my family's history and my in-laws as well, and their stories to Cuba. So it was the springboard for me to read other books and to look for other books and other historical fiction having to do with Cuba and different stories. And I'm a middle school English teacher, so I came across, and I tried to find something that I loved it so much. I was like, okay, I need to find something for my students similar to this. So I came across The Red Umbrella and loved it as well. Yeah, so it's more has to do with a Pedro Pan later on. So that's going to be something I'm going to be reading with my students this year. So, and I'm still looking around for like other books, anything now that has to do like historical fiction tied to Cuba. So thank you. It was a wonderful, wonderful read. And I ordered it for my mother-in-law in Spanish for Christmas this year. So I can't wait for her to enjoy it as well.
Well, thank you so much. And I have to give, sorry, I always give book shout outs. I just have to say also another book that's amazing since you spoke about Peter Pan. Carlos Ayers' Waiting for Snow in Havana.
That's
He was a
excellent.
Peter Pan kid. Yeah, it's his memoir. It's extraorinary. Like I can't recommend that one enough. So
I'm
if
reading
you-
that one right now.
Oh, okay.
That one?
Shelf.
I have it next on my Kindle, and then there's another one apparently that goes with that one as well. I think it's Learning to Die in Miami. It's like the sequel to that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Well, Chanel, I don't know if anybody else has anything to say, but thank you so much for your time. We'd love to have you again if we read your second book soon, or even, I already read The Last Train to Key West, but I would love for everyone else to read it.
Oh, well, I would love that. This was amazing. I can't tell you, it really means a lot to me, and hearing everyone's stories and how they connected with the books is just really special. So thank you.
Funny story,
so
that
much.
lady who did my nails came from Cuba maybe like 15 years ago, so she's more of a recent arrival. And every week that I would see her, she would ask me, what else did you read in the book? What's happening? So she's very excited, and it's now out in Spanish. So I'm getting it for her for Christmas, because she's like, she can read English, but she feels more confident in Spanish. So
Sure. Well, thank you so much. I love that.
thank you. Can I take a group picture, like a screenshot for everybody?
Yes. Yeah.
Smile. Get ready. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you, and thank you so much for joining us. It really meant a lot to us.
Thank you. Thank
We
you for
can't hear
having
you. We can't hear
me.
you, Rhonda.
Here we go. I just said I love the book. I can't wait to read the next one. I already have it by my bed, and I'm like, I read this all day Sunday outside, and my husband says, "Are you coming in today?" And I'm like, "No, not till I finish it." So it was fabulous.
So much.
Okay, take another
Thank
photo.
you.
Hold up your book.
Yay!
Yay!
I have the next one.
Oh, you guys all have it. Okay.
I have it on the Kindle. I can run and get it.
1, 2, 3. Okay. Great.
Hear from Tina.
Share.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Chanel.
Thank you so much. Have a good night. Thank you all.
Bye.
And thank you, Michelle, for putting this together.
Yes, thank
Please
you.
vote if you want something new in between, or if you want to go straight to when we left Cuba, because I'll be announcing it next week.
Whatever you pick, Michelle, you know I'm on. You know I'm
there. People to read.
You know I'm there.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.